There is a detail in Romans 8:26 that people read past with the same speed they read past road signs on a highway they have driven 100 times. The Spirit intercedes for us with groans too deep for words. The phrase is almost too familiar to be seen. But the moment you stop and look directly at it, it begins to pull apart like a frayed rope. Because the word Paul uses for groans is the same word he used 4 verses earlier for the groaning of creation stenagmos, a word that means a physical, almost involuntary sound of distress. Creation groans, we groan, and now the Spirit groans. The Spirit of God, the third person of the Trinity, is described as groaning. That is not a comforting sigh. That is not a gentle whisper. That is the sound something makes when it is under a weight it cannot bear. And the question the text does not answer immediately is the one that matters most. What does it mean for God's own Spirit to make a sound that belongs to the suffering of a fallen world? Think about what that does to your theology for a moment. If the Spirit groans, then suffering is not something God observes from outside. The Spirit is not a distant engineer watching the machine fail. The Spirit is in the machine, making the same sound the machine makes when it is breaking down and being remade at the same time. That changes the texture of prayer entirely. You are not sending messages to a celestial receiver who needs to be informed of your pain. You are joining a sound that is already being made inside you by the one who knows exactly what the pain is because he is feeling it with you. The groaning is not a defect in the system. The groaning is the system working exactly as it is supposed to work. The weight of this detail becomes heavier when you realize that Paul has already used this word in a very specific way. In verse 22, he writes that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. That is not a metaphor for general sadness. The image is precise. The groaning of creation is the sound of something being pushed toward a new shape. Labor pains that are violent and productive. Paul is saying that the entire universe is in the middle of a delivery room, and the groaning is the sign that something is being born, not that something is dying. And then just 4 verses later, he says the Spirit groans too. The word is identical. The logic is inescapable. The Spirit is not groaning because the Spirit is weak. The Spirit is groaning because the Spirit is involved in the same birth. The Spirit is not observing the labor from a distance. The Spirit is in the room, making the same sound the creation makes. That changes everything about what prayer is. Now consider the word Paul uses in verse 19 for creation's eager expectation. It is apokeridokia, a compound word that literally means to stretch the neck forward, to crane the head in anticipation. The image is of someone standing on tiptoe, straining to see something that is coming over the horizon. Creation is not just groaning passively. Creation is groaning with its whole body turned toward the future. And Paul says the Spirit intercedes with the same posture. The Spirit's groaning is not a noise of resignation. It is a noise of anticipation. The Spirit is not sighing because the present is unbearable. The Spirit is groaning because the future is so close that it can almost be tasted. This is where most readings of the passage go wrong. The common interpretation treats the Spirit's groaning as a kind of translation service. The Spirit takes your messy, broken prayers and turns them into something God can understand. But that reading makes the Spirit a helper who compensates for human inadequacy. It is not wrong exactly, but it is shallow, and it misses the theological scandal that Paul has set up. The Spirit does not groan because you cannot pray. The Spirit groans with you because the Spirit is also waiting for the redemption that has not yet arrived. Paul has already said in verse 23 that believers groan inwardly as we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. So we groan, creation groans, and now the Spirit groans. The groan is not the sign of a problem. The groan is the sign of participation. The Spirit is not fixing your prayer. The Spirit is praying the same prayer you are. In the same language you are using a language that has no words because words are too small for what is being asked for. The Greek word for too deep for words is elalidos, and it occurs nowhere else in the New Testament. It means something that cannot be expressed in speech, not because it is too quiet, but because it is too large. It is the silence that follows when language has reached its limit. In the ancient world, this word was used in medical texts for patients who had lost the ability to form articulate sounds, the moan of someone in extreme pain, the cry of someone who has passed the point of articulation. It was also used by the Stoic philosophers for the part of the human soul that cannot be captured in rational discourse. Paul takes a word that his Greco-Roman audience would have associated with the limits of human language and applies it to the prayer of the Holy Spirit. The Spirit's prayer is not less than speech. It is more than speech. It is the sound that comes after words have failed, and it is the only sound adequate to the magnitude of what is being asked. Now let that sit next to your own experience of prayer. Most people who try to pray have had the experience of sitting in silence with nothing to say, or of repeating the same phrases because they cannot find the language for what is actually inside them. That experience is almost always treated as a failure. We feel we should be able to articulate our needs. We feel that if we were more spiritual, we would have better prayers. But Paul is describing the exact opposite. The moment you cannot find words is not the moment your prayer breaks down. It is the moment your prayer most closely resembles the prayer of the Spirit, because the Spirit's prayer is not articulate. The Spirit's prayer is a groan, and that groan is the most powerful prayer in existence because it is the prayer of God Himself, asking for what God Himself wants, the redemption of everything. Your wordlessness is not a gap that the Spirit fills. Your wordlessness is the shape of the Spirit's own prayer. The Spirit does not give you words. The Spirit groans in you, and your inability to say anything is exactly what that groaning sounds like. But there is a problem that the text has not yet resolved. If the Spirit groans, then what is the Father doing? Paul says the Spirit intercedes for us according to the will of God. So the Spirit prays and the Father hears. But if the Spirit is God, then this is God praying to God. And if the Spirit is groaning, that means there is a sound within the Trinity that is not a word. That is not a small theological detail. It means that the prayer of the believer is not just a human activity that God helps. It is a participation in the inner life of God, a life that includes groaning. The Father does not need to be persuaded. The Father is not waiting for a better argument. The Father is already inclined toward what the Spirit is asking, because the Spirit is asking exactly what the Father wants. And yet the groaning continues. Why? Because the groaning is not about informing the Father. The groaning is about the nature of the waiting itself. Paul's argument has built a cage of tension. The whole creation is groaning. We are groaning. The Spirit is groaning. And the groaning is the sound of something that has not yet arrived. But the Spirit of God is not waiting for something to happen to God. The Spirit of God is fully God, fully present, fully powerful. So why would the Spirit groan? Why would the one who holds all things together sound like a woman in labor? The answer that Paul is pushing toward is one that shatters the normal categories of prayer. It is an answer that requires you to ask whether you have been praying to a God who is calm and distant, or to a God who is in the room, making the same sound you are making, waiting for the same thing you are waiting for. And that answer is not yet given. The Spirit groans and the Father hears, and the creation strains forward, and you are sitting in the middle of all of it with nothing to say. Part 1 ends there, with the question still open. If the Spirit groans, then what kind of God is this? The Spirit groans, and the question hangs in the air unanswered. What kind of God groans? What kind of God prays? What kind of God is in the delivery room with creation, making the same involuntary sound of distress that a woman makes when she is being torn open to bring something new into the world? The answer Paul is building toward does not resolve the tension by explaining it away. It resolves the tension by deepening it until you realize the tension was never the problem. The tension was the point, but that answer is not yet given. Paul does not hand it to you in a neat package. He makes you sit in the question long enough to feel its weight. The longer you sit, the more the question changes shape. It stops being a theological puzzle and starts being an invitation. What kind of God refuses to remain at a safe distance from suffering? What kind of God prays rather than simply commands? The question is not asking for information. The question is asking you to decide whether you can trust a God who is not immune to the sound of pain. Look at what Paul says about the Spirit's intercession. The word he uses is intercession, a compound verb that means to intercept, to meet on behalf of, to fall in with someone's case. It is a legal term from the Roman courts, where a patron would appear before the judge to speak for a client who lacked the skill or status to plead their own case. In that world, the courtroom was a place of precise rhetoric. The patron would have studied the case, prepared arguments, selected vocabulary that would sway the magistrate. Every word mattered. But here the twist is that the spirit does not speak. The spirit groans. The patron stands before the judge and makes a sound that has no syllables, no syntax, no grammar. Imagine the scene: the courtroom falls silent. The magistrate leans forward. The client waits in confusion. And the patron, the one trained in persuasion, opens his mouth and produces only the sound of a body under pressure. That is not a courtroom strategy. That is something else entirely. And Paul says that this groaning intercession happens according to God kata theon. The Spirit is not guessing what the Father wants. The Spirit is praying exactly what the Father wills, but in a form that bypasses the logic of persuasion entirely. The Father does not need to be convinced. The Father and the Spirit are already in perfect agreement. So the groaning is not for the Father's benefit. It is for the creation's. Now sit with what kata theon actually does to the sentence. The preposition kata with the accusative means according to in the sense of conformity. The Spirit intercedes in a way that is conformed to God. That is not a vague spiritual sentiment. It means the Spirit's groaning is the exact shape of God's will. There is no gap between what the Spirit asks and what the Father wills. The groan is not a request that might be denied. It is a request that is already the answer. The Father hears the groan and recognizes it as the sound of his own intention. This is why Paul can say that the Spirit intercedes for us, the groan is for us, but it originates in the Father's own desire. The Spirit is not bringing new information to God. The Spirit is bringing the creation into alignment with what God has already determined. And the mechanism of that alignment is a sound that bypasses words entirely. Here is where the resolution begins to take shape. If the Spirit's groaning is not about informing God, then it must be about something else. Paul has already told you what that something else is. The groaning of creation is the sound of hope. The groaning of believers is the sound of hope. And the groaning of the Spirit is the sound of hope. Not hope as in vague optimism, not hope as in crossing your fingers and hoping things turn out well, but hope as in the straining forward that Paul described earlier with apocarydokia, the craning of the neck toward a future that is certain but not yet visible. In the ancient world, that word was used for a runner leaning into the finish line, for a watchman on a tower squinting at the horizon, for a woman in labor pushing toward the moment of delivery. The Spirit groans because the Spirit is the one who guarantees that future, and the guarantee itself is a kind of waiting. The Spirit is not waiting for the Father to decide. The Father has already decided. The Spirit is waiting for the creation to catch up to what the Father has already determined. And the Spirit waits in solidarity with the creation that is still becoming. This is the theological weight that most readings miss. The Spirit's groaning is not a stopgap measure for weak human prayer. It is not a translation service for people who cannot pray properly. It is the very shape of eschatological hope. Hope is not a feeling that everything will work out. Hope is the groan of a creation that knows what is coming and cannot yet see it. And the Spirit participates in that groan because the Spirit is the one who is bringing that future into being. The Spirit does not groan because the Spirit is impotent or frustrated. The Spirit groans because the Spirit is present. Presence in suffering always takes the form of groaning when the suffering is not yet finished. You cannot sit in a delivery room with a woman in labor and remain silent and detached, checking your watch, waiting for the process to end. You groan with her because you are with her. The Spirit groans with creation for the same reason. The groaning is the sound of shared presence. Now take that into your own prayer life with brutal honesty. If the Spirit groans according to the will of God, then your own groaning is not aimless. You may not know what you are asking for. You may sit in silence with nothing but a weight in your chest, a wordless ache that you cannot name, the grief of a loss that has no language, the anxiety that has no single cause, the longing for something you cannot even describe. And that silence feels like failure. You tell yourself you should have more faith, better words, a stronger prayer life. But the Spirit knows what that ache is asking for. The Spirit takes that wordless ache and shapes it into a prayer that is perfectly aligned with the Father's will. Your inability to articulate your need does not mean your prayer is weak. It means your prayer is being carried by someone who knows exactly what you need. The groan you cannot form into sentences is already a perfect prayer because the Spirit has already formed it into a groan that the Father hears as the voice of His own Son. The Greek word alalitos, too deep for words now, takes on its full weight. It does not mean that the Spirit's prayer is inarticulate in the sense of being confused or unclear, as if the Spirit were mumbling and hoping the Father might catch the gist. It means that the Spirit's prayer operates at a level that human language cannot access. The Spirit prays in the language of the new creation, a language that has not yet been spoken because the new creation has not yet arrived. The groaning is the sound of that future language, breaking into the present like a seismic wave before the earthquake fully hits. It is the first syllable of the redemption that is coming, spoken before the full sentence can be formed. And you are invited to make that sound with the Spirit. Your wordless groan is not a failure of prayer. It is the most advanced form of prayer available to you this side of the resurrection. It is the prayer of the future, prayed in the present by the Spirit who already lives in that future. There is no other place in Scripture where the inner life of the Trinity is described in such intimate, almost vulnerable terms. Paul opens a door into the relationship between the Father and the Spirit, and what you see is not a calm exchange of divine ideas or a serene conversation between equals. What you see is the Spirit interceding with a sound that cannot be spoken, and the Father who searches hearts, the same verb erunao used in the Greek for a soldier searching a battlefield for survivors, for a miner digging through rubble for precious metal, finds the Spirit's groan and knows exactly what it means. The Father does not need translation. The Father needs no interpreter. The Father searches the heart and finds the Spirit already there, praying the exact prayer that the Father has been waiting to answer since before the foundation of the world. This is the answer to the question that has been hanging since the beginning. What kind of God groans? A God who is not content to redeem from a distance, who does not simply declare the new creation into existence from a throne far above the pain. A God who enters the labor room of creation and makes the same sound the creation makes. A God who prays in the language of the future, because the future is the only language big enough to hold what He is asking for. The Spirit's groaning is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of presence. The Spirit is not distant from your pain. The Spirit is in your pain, groaning with you, shaping your pain into a prayer that the Father hears as the very voice of His Son. And so the passage does not end with a command or a comfort. It ends with a reality that is both. The Spirit groans, you groan, and the Father who searches hearts knows what the Spirit is saying, which means He knows what you are saying even when you have no words. The prayer you thought was broken is the prayer that is most fully the prayer of God. The silence you thought was empty is filled with the sound of the Spirit. The groaning you thought was a sign that your faith was weak is the sign that your faith is being carried by someone who will not let it fall. The Spirit prays for you with groans too deep for words, and those groans are enough. They have always been enough. The only question left is whether you will stop trying to find better words, stop trying to impress God with your eloquence, stop apologizing for your silence, and simply let the Spirit groan in you as the Spirit has always intended to do.